Hey everyone, welcome back.
Yeah.
Today we're approaching things a bit differently.
Yeah,
Instead of one big book or report, we've got this collection of planning documents all focused on one place, Red Wing, Minnesota.
right. We've got, let's see, a housing analysis, the city's own strategic plan. There's a plan for a potential trail.
And even some state-level reports touching on history and water quality. It's quite a mix.
It is. And these documents, they really give us a snapshot of what city planners and the government in Red Wing are, well, focused on right now.
Exactly, so we're not doing a full history lesson or a travel guide here.
No, not at all. The idea is to see what these specific sources tell us, just these sources, about the challenges Red Wing is facing, their priorities, where they might be heading.
Okay, so let's jump into this stack then. According to these documents, what's really driving the city's immediate focus?
Well, the city government's strategic plan for 2024 to 2026, it lays out a few key areas, but one really big one is stabilizing their finances and getting a better handle on budgeting. And the plan explains why that's such a high priority, doesn't it? It points to a pretty unusual situation with their tax base.
Absolutely. As highlighted pretty clearly, Red Wing is very dependent on one major taxpayer, the Prairie Island Nuclear Power Generating Plant, PINGP.
That creates a lot of uncertainty, I imagine, more than most cities deal with.
Definitely volatility. The numbers in the plan showing the shift over just, 6 years, they're quite striking.
Yeah, lay those out for us.
Okay, so back in 2018, utility properties, mostly the power plant, paid about 57% of the city's total tax levy. Residential and other properties covered the other 43%.
Okay.
But fast forward to 2024, and that flipped. The utility share dropped to 44%, meaning residents and other non-utility owners had to pick up 56%.
Wow. So even if the city's total budget didn't go up massively, that shift puts a much heavier burden on homeowners.
Exactly. The plan gives a really concrete example. The city's overall property tax levy went up by 11% between 2018 and 2024, about $2.5 million.
Right.
But during that same time, the taxes paid by utility properties actually decreased by over $2 million.
So that difference plus the city's increase had to come from somewhere else.
It had to come from residential properties. Their taxes went up by almost $3 million. That translates to nearly a 63% increase for homeowners on average. It's a direct result of that dependence on the power plant's tax contributions.
Okay, that makes that stabilized finances goal make a whole lot of sense. What does the plan say they're doing to try and manage this?
It mentions working with groups like the Coalition of Utility Cities and Xcel Energy directly. They're also getting involved in state regulatory stuff.
Like what specifically?
Things like the Public Utility Commission's planning processes, integrated resource planning, certificate of need, basically trying to influence policies that might smooth out those big swings in the utility tax base.
Okay, so finance is a huge piece. But the strategic plan also highlights another major area: increase housing for all. Now, housing is a challenge everywhere, but what do these Red Wing sources say about their specific situation?
Yeah, both the strategic plan and the separate housing needs analysis really dig into this. They stress that new home construction just hasn't kept up with demand at any price point, really.
And that has knock-on effects.
Big time. The plan even says local employers are having trouble recruiting people because potential hires just can't find a decent place to live. Plus, rising construction costs and rents make affordability a major problem.
Does the housing analysis get specific about the type of housing that's most needed?
It does. It really points to a strong need for entry-level homes, starter homes, and also affordably priced move-up homes.
Move-up homes. Explain that a bit.
Well, there's this idea discussed in the analysis that if you build more, say, mid-range or slightly higher-end homes, it encourages people already living in starter homes to move into those.
Freeing up the entry-level housing stock.
Exactly. It creates turnover, which helps that part of the market.
So what are the specific roadblocks making this housing situation so tricky in Red Wing, based on these documents?
It seems like a combination of things. You've got the big picture stuff, like the economy, and high interest rates, obviously. But then there are local factors.
Such as?
A lack of good building sites is mentioned, especially land that's flat and already has utilities. They also note the local market is kind of different from the nearby Twin Cities metro.
Making it less appealing for big developers, maybe.
That seems to be the suggestion, yeah. Less attractive for regional builders. Then there's the age of the existing houses and apartments. That's factor two.
Older stock might need more work or just not meet current demands.
Right, and there's just a general shortage of rentals overall. plus concerns about the condition of some older rental buildings. They also raise this interesting point about losing naturally occurring affordable housing.
What does that mean exactly?
Basically, older, less expensive housing units that might be getting converted to other things.
Like short-term rentals?
Yeah,
Airbnbs?
that's mentioned as a possibility, yeah. Taking those naturally cheaper options off the long-term market.
Are there issues beyond just land and buildings, like community factors?
Yes, the sources actually bring that up pretty directly. They talk about neighborhood resistance, a sort of bias against denser housing projects, or anything perceived as affordable housing.
The not in my backyard phenomenon.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
And existing zoning rules are also cited as a barrier, maybe not allowing for smaller lots or different types of housing that could be more affordable, or making it hard to build on empty lots within existing neighborhoods.
And what about the builders themselves?
There's a perceived shortage, mentioned specifically, builders willing to put up spec homes, building before they have a buyer.
Especially for moderately priced homes.
Exactly. Or homes aimed at that middle income bracket.
And how do local incomes play into this whole picture?
That's a key piece. The housing analysis points out that average incomes in Red Wing are lower compared to some surrounding areas, which just compounds the affordability problem.
So, given all these challenges, what kind of solutions or strategies are floated in these documents?
Well, the housing analysis talks about exploring different ways to build. Modular housing comes up, or using SIP's structural insulated panels.
As potentially cheaper ways to build starter homes or rentals.
Potentially more cost-effective, yeah. And for rentals, they specifically suggest building rental townhomes instead of just big apartment blocks.
What's the thinking there?
The idea is they might appeal more to families or people wanting more space. They mention features like larger units, modern amenities, maybe attached garages, and some green space.
And is the city itself taking concrete steps? What does the strategic plan say?
Yeah, it lists several actions, things like moving ahead with rezoning certain areas targeted for multifamily housing. They're working with Habitat for Humanity on infrastructure for a specific project.
Where's that?
At the old St. John's Hospital site. Also collaborating with another group, Three Rivers Community Action, on land for housing tax credit projects. They're identifying key spots downtown and in the West End for future housing redevelopment.
So actively looking for opportunities.
Seems so. Even looking at potential land owned by the local state college campus.
Okay, and the housing analysis also broke down needs for specific groups within the community, right? Seniors, for example.
Yes, that's a significant part. It talks about the whole range of senior housing needed, independent living, assisted living, memory care.
Right.
It also mentions the most common disabilities among seniors in Goodhue County, where Red Wing is located, issues with mobility, hearing, and tasks related to independent living.
And what about homelessness? What do the sources say there?
The analysis uses data for the wider River Valleys region. It cites point-in-time counts suggesting around 500 people experiencing homelessness on any given night,
Wow.
and an annual estimate of maybe 4,800 people in total across the region needing help.
So what's the biggest need identified to address that?
Permanent supportive housing, or PSH. That's housing linked with services, especially needed for single adults and people experiencing long-term homelessness. There's also a call for more rapid rehousing programs and transitional housing.
Is there much transitional housing available now?
Very limited, according to the document. And the few units that exist, mostly in Red Wing itself, are apparently always full with a waiting list. That's a critical point they make.
And finally, on housing, the analysis looked at the barriers people actually face when they try to get housing help. What did that show?
The survey results were pretty stark. The number one personal barrier, reported by about 70% of clients, was simply having a low income.
Just not enough money.
Right. And the top system barrier, cited by 80%, was the lack of affordable housing options available in the first place.
So a fundamental mismatch between incomes and housing costs.
The document calls that the single biggest barrier. Other major issues people reported facing were things like bad credit, dealing with financial or medical emergencies, problems with criminal background checks during tenant screening, and limited transportation options.
Okay, let's shift gears quite a bit here. There's another document in our stack that looks at a potential recreational project, a trail connecting Red Wing with Hastings.
Ah, yes, the proposed Hastings Red Wing Trail Plan. It outlines the idea for a paved trail connecting the two towns.
What's the main goal or perceived benefit of building a trail like this, according to the plan?
It's seen as valuable for recreation, obviously, but also potentially as a transportation alternative. It ties into broader ideas about community design, encouraging physical activity.
Who uses these kinds of trails typically?
The plan notes typical uses are walking, running, biking, inline skating. And usually, most users come from relatively nearby.
But building something like this isn't straightforward. The planning document highlights quite a bit of public feedback, especially from landowners.
That definitely comes through. The document describes meetings and open houses where people whose property was on or near the proposed route voiced, well, significant skepticism and a lot of concerns.
What kind of concerns specifically?
Pretty practical stuff. Loss of privacy was a big one, impacts on hunting activities on their land, worries about trespassing and personal safety, and just basic questions about how they'd be compensated fairly if land was needed for the trail. Some comments even mentioned worries about, needing to deter trespassers or potential conflicts between trail users and hunters.
Beyond the people aspect, there are physical challenges too, right? Routing a trail through the landscape.
You're sure? The plan talks about trying to use old railroad grades where possible, but also having to navigate tricky terrain, wetlands, rivers.
Which might require building structures.
Yeah, things like boardwalks or bridges. They even looked at alternative routes like along a bluff edge or through Prairie Island and weighed the pros and cons and engineering difficulties of each.
And safety for trail users is obviously key.
Absolutely. The plan spends time on that, especially road crossings, deciding whether a crossing needs to be at the same level as the road or if you need an underpass or overpass based on traffic.
Based on speed and volume.
Right. And sticking to state design standards for the trail itself, signs, markings, all that.
Environmental factors too.
Yep. Managing stormwater runoff is mentioned, using native plants for stabilization, dealing with invasive species along the trail corridor. All part of the plan.
How about paying for it and maintaining it long term?
The document brings up the idea of maybe having a user fee, like another state trail has.
Like buying a pass?
Something like that. But it notes there's debate around that. Some think fees ensure better upkeep. Others worry it limits access for the public and makes it less of a community asset. It also briefly touches on different ways to acquire land, maybe not buying it outright, but acquiring development rights instead.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit now. We also had a couple of state-level reports in the mix. They give some wider Minnesota context, right?
That's right. There's a report from the Minnesota Historical Society about how they use state legacy amendment funds, and then the state's water quality monitoring strategy.
So starting with the history report, what kinds of things does the state fund across Minnesota with that money, according to this document?
It covers a really broad range. Things like statewide surveys to find historical sites, digitizing old photos, films, oral histories, making collections accessible.
Preservation work, too.
Yes, funding assessments and planning for preserving historic buildings and artifacts. Also supporting museum exhibits. They mentioned examples like one on historic Fort Snelling or traveling exhibits on topics like Black citizenship history.
What else?
Programs for veterans history, special programming at historic sites like Jeffers petroglyphs, funding research and oral history projects, public classes on preservation.
So helping people learn how to care for old buildings.
Yeah, through groups like Rethos.
Yeah.
And generally helping local historical societies across Minnesota build their capacity. It's quite comprehensive.
A lot going on statewide. But just to be clear, this report didn't give specific historical details about Red Wing itself.
That's crucial. Based only on this document we looked at, it details the statewide programs and gives examples from other places. It doesn't contain specific historical facts or narratives about Red Wing. It just shows the framework Red Wing exists within regarding state-level history funding.
Understood. And the water quality document, what's the takeaway there?
That one outlines Minnesota's statewide strategy for monitoring the health of surface water lakes, rivers, and groundwater.
How do they go about that? What methods does it describe?
It talks about using a watershed-based approach for surface water, different sampling techniques like grabbing single samples or using automated monitors for pollutants.
Are they looking for specific things?
Yes, it mentions tracking concerns like pharmaceuticals, personal care products getting into the water, and PFAS chemicals. For groundwater, it describes how multiple state agencies work together to monitor quality and quantity.
Okay, so again, like the history report, this gives us the big picture of the state's methods and general findings, but not specific data for Red Wing's water.
Exactly. Based only on the strategy document, you learn how Minnesota monitors water statewide. But it doesn't provide local water quality results for Red Wing itself.
Right. So bringing all these different documents together, then the city's own plans on finance and housing, the look at the potential trail, the state context reports, what kind of picture emerges of Red Wing today?
Well, it's a picture painted, again, entirely by this specific set of sources we examined. It shows a city actively engaged in planning. It's facing some really significant kind of unique financial pressures because of the power plant tax base.
Yeah.
It's clearly grappling with a very complex housing shortage that has multiple causes and no easy answers. And it's considering major projects, like that trail, that come with their own technical and community challenges.
All while existing within these larger state systems for things like history preservation and environmental monitoring.
Precisely. It's a snapshot of a city navigating some very real contemporary issues.
So when you look at all these interconnected threads, the fragile finances, the push for housing for everyone, the debates around a new recreational trail, what does this collection of planning documents make you think about the complexities of running and shaping a community like Red Wing today?